So legalization and decriminalization are two very different approaches. So in legalization, normally that there are laws and regulations that define where, when, and how sex work can be operated. So the well-known example is the Netherlands, the Dutch model, that in Holland you have a certain district where the sex workers can work legally. So decriminalization, on the other hand, means that there is an absence or removal of laws and policies that prohibit the sex work. This is the example of New Zealand and New South Wales, the state of New South Wales of Australia. And in this context, sex work is regulated under the health and safety workplace rules and policies, just like any other business. And this approach is proven to be very effective, protecting sex workers' health and also prevent STI and HIV infections. So the legalization approach, according to the global evidence, does not work because a vast majority of sex workers work outside of the legal venues and they continue to be vulnerable. So in Vietnam, we have now the Ordinance of Sex Work Prevention and Control, which was enacted in 2003. So under this law, Vietnam takes the full criminalization approach. That means both selling and buying sex services, as well as the associated activities like pimping or brothel keeping, all prohibited. And although the government took a big step forward by abolishing the so-called O5 center, the detention center for sex workers, and in some localities there are good programs for harm reduction, meaning addressing the vulnerability of sex workers to HIV and STI and violence incidents. Still, the legal approach is very much criminalization approach. So in this context, there are many preconditions that Vietnam need to meet before they even talk about decriminalization. The first thing is that we need to have a shared understanding that sex workers should not be considered social evil. And social evil approach fuels the stigma and discrimination, which is the main barriers for sex workers to seek support and seek punity seek the support protection from police if they suffer from violence. So it is really important that we have a more accommodating approach towards this issue. And secondly, we need to recognize the vital role of the civil society organizations, including the sex worker-led organizations. And this is really critical when we talk about sex work laws. And sex workers would say, nothing about us without us. It's an important message from sex workers. And government has taken a big step forward again by inviting sex workers in the different policy forums. But more needs to be done to really integrate their voices into the legal system on sex work. And our role is really to help the government to have a very constructive, evidence-based, rights-based dialogue to find a good path towards the decriminalization. And it will not be easy, but we would stand ready with other partners to help support the government of Vietnam and civil society. So in New Zealand, since they decriminalized sex work in 2003, they have seen a lot of improvements, both in terms of human rights and also public health outcomes. And the first big improvement was the access to justice for sex workers. When sex work was criminalized, sex workers could not go to the police even when they were suffering from violence, from clients, policemen or brothel keepers. So the situation for sex workers' vulnerability really improved, and this was a great achievement in terms of human rights of sex workers. And secondly, a lot of people worry about maybe the decriminalization will create a huge number of new sex workers, or the social morale will be deteriorated. But in fact, this didn't happen in New Zealand. And even some parliamentarians say that the sex workers' number actually slightly decreased. So the social morale did not get affected, and also the sex workers had a better access to STI, HIV prevention, as well as sexual reproductive health services. And in fact, the Lancet study, the very well-known study, concluded that if the decriminalization of sex work can happen in this world, female sex workers' HIV prevalence rate will decrease by 46%. That was the estimate. Sex work and sex in general is a complicated topic, and a lot of people have very mixed emotions, complicated emotions. But we believe that this is a very important issue whereby all stakeholders need to come together to have a very open conversation, evidence-based conversation, to create a better policy. And this is very much in line with the new SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, where we want to make sure no one will be left behind. Well, this is a $1 million question, I think. But I think Vietnam has a very good foundation in terms of respecting human rights. The 2013 Constitution clearly includes the human rights. So according to that spirit, the Vietnam, I believe, has a capacity to really look at this issue from rights perspective and bring in a lot of stakeholders into the dialogue. From the United Nations perspective, of course, we would advocate for the decriminalization approach, which is found to be most effective. However, we understand that there are many issues the government needs to consider, and our role is really to help the government to have a very constructive, evidence-based, rights-based dialogue to find a good path towards the decriminalization. And it will not be easy, but we would stand ready with other partners to help support the government of Vietnam and civil society and sex workers.
Xin cảm ơn bà đã tham gia chương trình.